Hey, let me educate you, yeah, yeah. Don't be having cats around your crib that's posing like they... Good evening to all of you out there in Zoom land, and welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, we are honored to host a record number of attendees for our season finale with the incredible Ijeoma Oluo. For those of you who are new to Talk of the Stacks, it's a free author lecture series produced by Friends with authors who focus on the craft of writing, as well as urgent social, economic, and global topics. Now, on evenings like this, I have to say that I miss you all so much and wish we were all together again at Minneapolis Central Library. But I know that we will get through this in the months to come and look forward to that time in the year ahead. For now, thank you for joining us live from your homes. On behalf of the library and Friends, we would like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that here in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. This land and the Dakota people belong together. And by offering this land acknowledgement, we can affirm Dakota's sovereignty and we hold ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. Thank you. Well, I would next like to recognize our generous sponsors who help make this free series possible. A special thank you to our two presenting sponsors, the Star Tribune and US Bank, as well as our two new sponsors, Knorr Companies and LSE Architects. Finally, I have just a couple of tips to pass along to help you better enjoy your virtual experience this evening. If you are interested in captioning, click on the arrow next to the closed captioning icon and select Show Subtitles. If you are interested in asking our author a question, you can do so at any time throughout tonight's broadcast by clicking on the Q&A icon. Later on, towards the end of the program, our Friends board member extraordinaire, Kyle Parsons, will join us on screen to help facilitate that part of the conversation. Kyle, who is a trained group facilitator and diversity, equity, and inclusion coach, speaks publicly on topics centered on race, intergenerational difference, and intercultural communications. We are so lucky to have him part of our Friends board and working on behalf of the library. And now, here to introduce our special guest is another Friends board member extraordinaire, LSE Architects CEO and co-founder, Mohammed Lal. For more than 15 years, Mohammed has partnered with Hennepin County Library to create the most amazing award-winning community-focused gathering spaces at the historic libraries that include Sumner, East Lake, North Regional, Nokomis, and Weber Park libraries in Minneapolis, as well as the recently completed renovation of the Oxborough Library in Bloomington. Thank you so much for joining us, Mohammed and Kyle, and I hope all of you enjoy the evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Christy, and good evening to you, our library patrons and friends. I'm so thrilled to join you tonight for this exciting talk with the astonishing Ijeoma Oluo. I'm really excited to do this because both Ijeoma and I have Nigerian fathers. My niece happens to be named Ijeoma, so I wouldn't pass up a chance to introduce her. I'd like to also acknowledge this year, we've all struggled through a number of community, civil unrest, and the pandemic. We as board members here at Hennepin County, I take pride in supporting the library's quick pivot to transform service models to safely meet the needs of those most vulnerable to COVID-19 and meet the urgent, overwhelming demand for resources that offer guidance towards a more anti-racist and equitable society. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Ijeoma Oluo. Ijeoma is a Seattle-based writer, speaker, and activist. Her New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race, was hailed as a landmark book of our time. and her writing has been featured in the Washington Post, NBC News, Elle Magazine, and Time, among others. She was named one of the Roots 100 most influential African Americans, Seattle Magazine's most influential people, and Seattle Meets Most Influential Women, and is the recipient of the 2018 Feminist Humanist Award. Also, the 2020 Harvard Humanist of the Year Award. Her latest book, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, was recently celebrated by Publishers Weekly as, in quotes, an essential reckoning with race, sex, and power in America, end quote. It is my great honor to welcome Ijeoma Oluo to Talk of the Stacks.
Hey everybody, hope you all are well. It is a real pleasure to talk with you today. I wish that we could do this in person, but of course, I'm so glad that we have a safe way to be able to connect in these times. I think that that really matters. So thank you for attending. Thank you for being safe. And I hope that you enjoy this chat. This is, going to be pretty casual. I really look forward to your questions. And I will talk a little bit about this book. So I got the idea for Mediocre. I talk about this in the first chapter about what was kind of behind this book. It was a book kind of born out of frustration. I've been writing about issues of race and gender. And I do want to clarify too, because I know that Publishers Weekly said it was a work on race and sex. Sex and gender are two separate things. This is really a book on race and gender. I've been writing on race and gender for years now. And for many people, especially people of color who write about these issues, I think there's this kind of general frustration a lot of us have had around the way in which we've been talking about white men, especially since 2016. Kind of this idea that angry white men kind of fell from the sky, were just invented, and people asking, why is this white man angry? Why is this white man angry? And kind of refusing to look at white men as a political construct and look at the history of how we have defined white men through time in America, and where this present moment, this present political and social moment fits into that. And if you are a person of color in this world, a woman in this world, and especially a woman of color in this world, in the United States, I think you're very familiar with what angry white men look like and what they look like as a power structure, and aware of the history. And we have to be. It's kind of a mode of survival. You have to know why things are working the way they are, or at least try to. And as someone who, for a job, has spent years looking at this and writing about this, what I wanted was for us to stop treating this current moment as if it's an anomaly and really start taking responsibility for the moment. But that requires then that people understand the history. And so this book really started out, as a series of questions and, about how we got to where we are. But before I talk about that further, I think I just want to read a little bit from the book. I haven't done this yet in any of my book events. I for a while, with the last book, So You Want to Talk About Race, was a pretty personal book in some ways. And I had stopped doing readings from it, but I haven't gotten a chance to do a reading from this one. So I'm going to do a little bit of a reading, just a few minutes, because honestly, I don't know, I don't love being read to. So I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 7, which is about football and the fear of Black men, called Go Fucking Play. It may surprise you to learn that American football, a sport today known for the Black athletes who showcase their physical speed and strength every Sunday, was created to be played by wealthy white men. There was a lot of money to be made after the Civil War, and during the United States' violent expansion into Western territories in the 1800s. Families newly wealthy from the growth of railroads and trade, brought by the forced displacement of indigenous peoples, were looking at their own sons nervously. It had taken a lot of strength and force to build their wealth and power, and it would take more strength and force to maintain them. Would their rich, spoiled offspring have what it takes to grow an American empire? What could wealthy young men do to cultivate strength and aggression if they lived a life of ease? They could, perhaps, play a rough sport. The very foundation of football in this country comes out of fears of ruling class mediocrity and fears of the mediocrity of their own children. I'm sitting at a bookstore cafe in Washington, D.C., across a table from a noted author on the history of race and sport, Dave Zirin. It's his opening line for our conversation on football and Blackness, and it surprises me. But I shouldn't be surprised to be immediately learning from Zirin. He has written multiple best-selling books on sport and has been nominated for an NAACP Image Award for outstanding literary work, and is widely recognized within the sports world as an authority on sports history and sports labor issues. He's the guy to talk to about this. Like the mandate to go west, young man, football was born out of muscular Christianity. Theodore Roosevelt, American cultural icon and the nation's 26th president, was, as we've seen, a big proponent of this doctrine. Teddy Roosevelt, he was like the prom king of this culture of toxic masculinity in sports and seeing sports as a substitute for the fight for empire and war, explains Zirin. American football had its beginnings in the Ivy League colleges, which were attended by young elites like Roosevelt. Its early days were so violent that dozens of student athletes died every year, nearly dooming the sport before it fully got off the ground. The Smithsonian detailed some of the injuries recorded during a particularly brutal college game in 1905. 4 concussions, 3 kicks in the head, 7 broken collarbones, 3 grave spinal injuries, 5 serious internal injuries, 3 broken arms, 4 dislocated shoulders, 4 broken noses, 3 broken shoulder blades, 3 broken jaws, 2 eyes gouged out, 1 player bitten, and another knocked unconscious 3 times in the same game, 1 breastbone fractured, 1 ruptured intestine, and 1 player dazed. As outrage began to rise over the death toll of the sport, the New York Times placed football right alongside the lynching of Black Americans as our nation's 2 curable evils. Through the great effort of powerful defenders like Roosevelt, who claimed that it is mere unmanly folly to try to do away with the sport because the risk exists, football supporters instead pressured colleges to form the NCAA to increase oversight and decrease deaths and serious injury. Although football persevered through the crisis to become one of our nation's most beloved pastimes, I am not what anybody would call a sports person. My mom signed me up for a flag football league in 5th grade, and I still haven't figured out what I, or the team that had to endure my sulky attitude and extreme lack of athletic ability, had done to warrant such punishment. I have watched a few football games, especially during my hometown Seahawks Super Bowl winning season in 2014, but I don't think anybody could confuse me for a fan. Instead, my interest in football has been almost entirely political, increasing with the University of Missouri protests in 2015 and continuing with the national anthem protest started by Colin Kaepernick. To me, the idea of sitting around watching a bunch of Black bodies crash into each other to the delight of white team owners and managers is not entertaining. Even though I can respect and appreciate the great efforts the athletes put forth, the sport has long represented to me the exploitation of Black labor and Black bodies and little else. But I have come to value, if often with dismay, the way in which we can see the reflection of American racial attitudes through the sport. Modern day American football has in many ways progressed and digressed racially along with American racial attitudes. While many would look at the Black millionaires it produces and think that the sport represents racial progress and Black success, it still also represents the ways in which racism and white supremacy have successfully moved out of the spotlight of violent racial terror and instead woven their way through the fabric of both the sport and society, existing and operating constantly, yet only making themselves more visible when the sport's integrity is directly threatened. Today, Black athletes make up the majority of popular American football team rosters, but that was not always the case. My great-grandfather on my mother's side was one of the early white players. I remember my mom showing me pictures of Daddy Bud from the early 1930s in his football uniform before a train accident crushed his foot and his professional prospects. My mom watched football in the tradition of her white family, so it did not carry the same complications for her that it carried for me, although perhaps it should have. That American football was invented, at least in part, to create and maintain a violent white male ideal, an ideal so brutal that it claimed dozens of promising young lives each year, is a history that should perhaps be just as troubling to white Americans as the current state of football is to Black Americans. The appeal of early football was white male dominance, a hierarchy that many in the sport tried to maintain by excluding Black players. Although football was eventually integrated, that integration stopped at the surface and hid all the ways in which the sport still worked to maintain the ugliest of white male power. The white male dominance that was first demonstrated in how white players tackled each other on the field was diverted to how they could control the physical power of Black men. Yes, the majority of players are now Black, but those calling the shots, the owners, the managers, the quarterbacks, are primarily white men. White fans shifted their relationship to football as well. They identify with the quarterback if they identify with a player at all. Why is fantasy football so popular? Zyron asked rhetorically. It's popular because when it comes to football, fans identify with being an owner or a general manager, not with being a player. Why don't they identify with being a player? Well, a couple of reasons. One, race, without a question, he explains. And two, because being an NFL player is to be a very specific kind of athlete. You're 6'3", 280 pounds. You're running 40 yards in 4.5 seconds. And fans, white fans, view these NFL players as half gods, half chattel. So that's the beginning of one of the chapters in the book. And I will leave you all to read the rest if you pick up the book. But for me, that's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And it surprised a lot of people to see me writing about football. As I've made clear, I am not an athletic person. I'm not a huge football fan. But this is, as I said, it is my favorite chapter in the book. I think that this book kind of took me to a lot of different places that I wasn't expecting. It really, when I set out to write this book, I didn't say, this is my whole agenda. It was, I want to show the story of how we got to where we are. And that could be very broad, right? The history of white male identity in America is hundreds of years, covering, every aspect of our society. So what I started with were just general questions. What was the ideal definition of manhood in the 1950s? What did our economy look like? What was happening in our churches? And from all these different areas of society. And so I and two research assistants we just started with these basic questions, like maybe 30 questions throughout 200 years of American history, and just kind of looked to see what we would find. And from that, we pulled hundreds and hundreds of articles and books that answered some of these questions or gave us different parts of the picture of what white manhood in America has looked like over the years, and the different ways it has impacted populations of color and people who aren't men. And so from that, I started reading through these, massive amounts of data, and started seeing threads through history that kind of told this story that would, bring us through time, and we could see kind of how we got where we are. And, football was definitely one of them. I like many, have thought about the current, protests these last few years in the NFL, and have seen it through, quite a contemporary political lens. And so seeing the history of football and how it's been used as a tool of white male power through its entire history was really interesting to me. And I learned a lot while I was writing, and got to talk to some, really amazing people, including athletes who've participated in the protests in this process. But other chapters were like that, where it just kind of took me in spaces I didn't know I was going to be in. There were chapters I knew from the beginning I was going to write, and then there were whole surprises that just hit me halfway through. And there were chapters I was sure I was going to write that really, never made it into the book, even though one day I would love to write about them. So the book kind of takes, it's set where each chapter is kind of it's a large chapter with 2 or 3 subsections inside. And each one is kind of around a theme of story. And so there's, the story of the Great Expansion West. There's the story of football. There's, the story of the Great Migration. There's stories around women in the workplace. There's stories of American education. And it looks at these stories to highlight through history, and kind of brings you from the past, and then, to middle American history and through to the present. I started writing this book, I would say a little over 2 years ago. And I was finishing up edits this spring and early summer. And it was really interesting because as the pandemic hit, I could not have predicted 2020. I don't think anyone could have predicted how 2020 was going to turn out. But as I was, editing and finishing up chapters of this book in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of one of the, wildest presidential elections we've seen, in the middle of a global uprising for Black lives, there were a lot of questions as to whether or not I was going to be revising or adding additional notes to the book. And I decided not to. I went through and I reread it, and I realized, could I draw a line from what I had already written in the book in history to where we are now? And even though I couldn't have predicted, yeah, it all tracks. And so I wanted it to kind of stand. I wanted the point to be that this isn't about one person. It's not about one president. It's not, about one election. It's not about one particular time. It's about the choices we keep making over and over and over again, and how we need to make better ones. And that's what I hope the reader will get out of it. My goal for this book, I've been asked a lot, how can you have a title like this and expect white men to read it and do better? And that's not necessarily my goal. When I'm writing, what I'm writing about here is, like I said, white male identity as a political and social construct. And that means that it's something that's upheld by more than just white men. It's something we all participate in. The truth is that the current power structure we have right now can't be maintained just by the will of white men alone. And what I want is for people who do recognize that something is wrong, to be able to put it in context and see that the path we're on is never going to yield a better result, that we really have to make better choices about what we value, where we spend our money, how we vote, the way in which we define success and power in this society if we want a real change. There is no way around it. And yet I find time and time again that there's this desire to find a way to implement change that doesn't directly threaten harmful definitions of white male power in this country. And so part of what I wanted to show in this book was how protecting that time and time again, and protecting it is a way of protecting white male mediocrity, because the results we get are tepid at best. How much it costs us as a society, all of us, regardless of race or gender or ethnicity, it is costing us greatly. And I do believe that our society is really hitting an extreme crisis point. We are, I think that white male identity in America is on a suicide mission, where if it's not going to be what it is, it's going to take us all over the edge. And I want us to pull back, and I want us to say, no, there's another way. This book, though, isn't necessarily a book that offers solutions. I don't believe that a book, when we're writing about something as complex as race and gender in America, that a book has to be everything. This book is really kind of a diagnostic to get people to understand some of the scope of the problem, so that we can start looking for solutions and working towards them. But I absolutely believe that solutions are possible. This work is really tough, and writing this book was probably the toughest thing I've ever done in my professional career. One of the toughest things I've done just as a human being has been, diving into this horrific and traumatizing history while also being a Black woman in this country. But I do it because I think that we can do better, because I believe in people. And I believe that we all have the capacity to change. And I think if there's one thing that people may not realize, is that the real pessimism about what white men can do, what white society can do, what male society can do, is really held by white men. I do this work, and so many other people do this work, because we believe change is possible, because we know people can grow and change, because we know we can change these structures. If I didn't, I would just, there would be no reason to go through all of this. But I also wrote this book because there is a collective gaslighting that happens to women and people of color in this society, that says that what happens to us, the oppressions we face, the hardships we face, are not actually part of a system, that we're just unlucky or unworthy. And it harms us. It harms us emotionally and psychically. It stops us from being able to defend ourselves. And it stops us from feeling like we have the right to demand change. And I want this book to be a testament to what we are surviving, and to what we really do face, and to back up, the truth that these issues have to be taken seriously. So often I hear from people who really feel like, from women, people of color, and especially women of color, who know something is wrong, and then they try to name it, and they're told it's just in their heads. And it's not. And not only is what's happening right now real, but it's part of a pattern. And I want people to understand that, we cannot change from things that keep happening. We can't heal from things that keep happening. We have to recognize the patterns. We have to change our behaviors. We have to pull ourselves away. And so I hope that this can serve as an accounting. It can serve as support for populations impacted by white male supremacy, to recognize that our grievances are real and that we have the right to demand change. But I also hope that all of us, regardless of race, gender, or ethnicity, recognize how we play into these systems. When I wrote this, I wasn't thinking this is going to teach us that we have to change white men. I wrote this thinking, this is going to show the need for us to change our collective values. This is going to show the need for us to recognize that our proximity towards these ideals, even like as a Black woman, is never going to lead to liberation or success. It's just going to lead to more pain and more oppression. And that we have to really investigate, first and foremost, where we are playing a part in these harmful systems. So that's kind of my goal for the book. I hope that it will get people thinking and conversing, and start looking at more, and start thinking about solutions, start thinking about the conversations we're having, how we're raising our children, how we are engaging with media and with government. It's really vital that we do that work. I'm really proud of the book. For me, as a writer, it was a real stretch for me. You know, it's a very different book than So You Want to Talk About Race, even though both, of course, touch on race and gender. Structurally, it was a very different book. It really stretched me as a writer in ways that I'm very proud of. And it was also, like I said, a super traumatic process. I feel sometimes like writing a book is like having a baby, you know, where you're like, I'm never doing that again. That was awful. That was painful. I don't want to do it. And then a little while later, you're like, oh, maybe I'll do it again. That sounds fun. And then you're like, why did I do this? And this was definitely a book where I felt as I was writing it, like, oh gosh, why did I sign up for this? But I'm so proud of it. I am really proud of this book. I think it's a really good book. It taught me a lot. And it was really nice to work on a project that I felt like I got a lot out of as well. And I hope that, you know, as readers, that you'll get a lot out of it too. I hope that it's something that will have you seeking out other information and pulling up other articles. I hope there are things in there that really get you thinking about things you've said or taken for granted in society. And I hope that it also leads to, you know, opens the door, if this book is successful, to more writers being able to openly investigate these issues. You know, as a Black woman, it's been really nice since writing So You Want to Talk About Race to hear from other writers who say they felt like there wasn't as much of a market for books like this. And then there was. There weren't, when I wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, you know, a lot of books that were showing practically like how to talk about these issues. And a lot of it that just wasn't sexy, right? There wasn't the outrage porn. It wasn't, you know, full of the trauma. And then suddenly it was selling. And then there were other writers of color who were able to write these practical books on race to add to all the different types of amazing books we have out there. And I hope that this is one as well that gets people looking at the story behind where we are, you know, as people, the story behind our power structures. And I want to open the way, you know, for different types of writing and melding different styles. And for other writers of color, especially women of color, to be able to document our history from a viewpoint that often doesn't get shown. And that's, you know, if that comes of this, I would be incredibly grateful. So yeah, that is my book, and I hope that you will enjoy it. Enjoy is always a weird word when you're talking about books that delve into, you know, difficult and traumatic events, but I hope that you get something of value from it, regardless of your background, regardless of your race or gender. I really hope that you get something of value from it, and then it leads you down new paths of discovery and discussion. And so that said, I think it's about time for us to go to Q&A.
Hi, thank you so much for that, Ijeoma. That was really wonderful, and it was so great hearing just kind of your process in it. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyle Parsons, and I am a proud member of the Friends of the Hennepin County Library Board, and really excited to serve as a moderator here and try to keep this rich discussion going between all of you. We have a ton of questions in the chat, but I just want to remind for anybody who didn't see, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom. Please click that and feel free to enter in more questions. I'll be monitoring that along with the Friends staff, and we'll get questions to our honored guest here. If it's all right with you, I'd love to go first. And just in hearing you talk about it, you know, I think there's real power. You use the term gaslighting and the things we are told that are not real, that are not happening to us. And then I hear on the other side, you talking about what a struggle this book was to write. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, you said it came from frustration, right? Like, I can tell you're proud of this. You should be. It sounds like more impactful work, like your first book. But I'm curious, where does that need to correct the narratives, the false narratives, right? To battle the gaslighting versus that personal investment it takes to put yourself on the line. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you get to this place in spite of all that challenge?
Yeah, you know, I think part of it is just my nature in that I've never been a person to not be able to say the thing. You know what I mean? Like you're in a room and I'm like, why isn't anybody calling this what it is. I don't understand. And of course, it's gotten me a lot of grief over the years, but it's part of who I am. And there's a lot of pain in not saying, what needs to be said. And so I decided years ago that, I had to make a choice. I was either going to start saying it, or I was going to spend the rest of my life trying not to. And I decided to. And part of it, I think, is also hubris, the thought that if you don't do it, no one's going to. If I don't write this book, no one's going to. If I don't say this, no one's going to say it. And it's being observant and watching and hoping someone will. And then when they're not, it's like, fine, and there's this bit of this idea that like, it will never happen if I don't do it, which is of course not true. I think that 400 years into this system of white supremacy, especially, we're all trying to find different ways to just get the same message through. This is a problem. But when you want people to be moving forward and acting, and that's all I want, is I want people to move forward and act. If you're watching what is being said, then you can see where people keep tripping up over and over again. And this was just such a source of frustration. And part of me felt like I was never going to get any peace. I was always going to be asked to write these crappy articles about one racist thing that happened versus this other racist thing that happened versus this sexist thing that happened and this other sexist thing that happened. And no one was actually going to say, we want to know what the pattern looks like. We want to know how we're participating in this. And so I decided to write the book. And once it hit me, that was it. And then it was like, well, crap, what did I just sign up for? How do I do this now? That's the thing about book advances, you say you want to write a book and then they give you money, and then you spend that money and then you're like, oh no, I have to write the book now. So you got to make that work. So that's a huge part of it. You spend the money.
I love it. You say you want to write a book and they give you money. I say I want to write a book and they're like, that's okay, buddy. You keep reading books, but they definitely give you money, and they should. I'm curious. There's another thing you said in there, and then I swear I'm going to get to these audience questions because they are blowing up. They have so many questions, but a word I heard you use that I think is really important here, and I don't want us to miss, is patterns. You've used patterns a couple times, and I think if you look at mediocre, you're talking about these patterns, the historical patterns that play out. I'm just curious, as you look and as we try to do this work of decentering white males, white male power structures, whiteness, maleness, all of these things, as we look to decenter, what are those actions you want to see? That's what you said you want, right? You want to see people take action. So how would somebody listening start taking that action you're so eager to see?
So I think a lot of it varies, right, on who you are, right? For people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people, I would say first and foremost, what I want you to do is to recognize that you have the right to not participate in these systems. You have the right to say that this is messed up. I want you first and foremost to look at how you can heal yourself and your community from the ways in which you've been harmed by this, and recognize that needs to take priority, because we are told time and time again, right? We are told not only are these things not happening to us, but if they are, then we have to sacrifice ourselves on the altars of change. It's about educating and changing white men and whiteness, and not about our own healing and separating ourselves from it, and recognizing perhaps where we need to distance ourselves from these harmful narratives and messaging. So I'd say that's the number one priority, I would say, for especially like women of color, right? People who are at the crossroads of both of these identities. But where people gain power from their proximity to white men, whether you are a white man, whether you are a white woman, whether, even as a light-skinned person, at times I do, then it's about looking at where you participate in the system and looking at where you benefit from it and saying, okay, I'm benefiting here. That means I have some power. So I need to act differently. And so start looking at first, I want people to do an honest accounting and start naming it what it is. So if, when we're talking about whiteness, name it. There isn't regular, normal, and then people of color and women, right? There is whiteness, there is manhood, there's white manhood, and it's a political structure and it's an identity. And where we participate in it and where we know where we're setting our norms to it, we have to recognize where we say professional means you're emulating white manhood, right? Instead of it's professional, right? We need to start naming and listing that and pulling away from it and divesting from it. And so where we are invested, whether that's financially, politically, socially, we first have to do that accounting so that we can divest. And that's really what the work looks like, and talking with other people. Not everyone's going to realize it all at once. And so where you recognize that you've upheld this or been a part of this, spread the news, how you're divesting, let other people know so that they can think about it, come up with their own ideas as well. But it matters. I'm a mother of 2 boys. And so even in writing this and thinking about like all of the, little things I've let slide that tell them that power means, acting this particular way that can be really harmful, or just not challenge the media they're consuming and the way in which they're engaging with the world as vigorously as they should. It's vital. But then looking at, even as someone who worked as a professional, all the career advice given to me that basically says, get as close to acting like this version of a white man as you can. Well, we all know, if anyone who's worked with like a mediocre white man knows that this isn't an effective, but it still gets you promoted. So then the question is, how do I divest from that? How do I call this out? How do I demand change? And that's really what I want people to start doing.
Thank you so much. I love hearing it. I want to keep asking questions now. But I'm going to go to one here in the chat from Tori Wagoner. And there's a few questions sort of in this vein, but wondering if you could talk a little bit about white feminism and the ways in which white feminists uphold mediocre white men and maintain the patriarchy while also claiming to dismantle it.
Absolutely. I think that's part of, why I keep saying I want people to look at this as a political and social construct, because when it's as a power structure, it's something that we're all complicit in to varying degrees. And white women are often the most complicit outside of white men to this structure. And so a lot of it is recognizing whether or not you're giving up your own liberation for your proximity to oppressive power. And a lot of white women have done that, have said, this is better than nothing. This is better than the risk of change, is to uphold the power that my sons, my husbands, my brothers will have or may have in this system, even if it means I will truly never be free. And there are a good amount of white women, and I'm not even going to say a little bit, a lot of white women really believe that there's a way that they can get free without ridding this country of the violent racism and especially anti-Blackness that also upholds the patriarchy. And I really do want white women to realize that your liberation is actually tied in Black liberation. And there is no way you can actually overcome the patriarchy or even the way the patriarchy impacts you and allow anti-Blackness to stand and allow systemic racism to stand, because it upholds the patriarchy. And so it's really important for many white women to sit and realize that they're still holding on to the security blanket of their proximity to white male power. And you will not get liberation unless you let that go. And you have to have faith that there's something better on the other side of that.
Even though that's scary, right? That's the only way we all get free. I love that. There's a question here from Sumyat Thu, who said, how do you think toxic masculinity is intertwined with whiteness and white supremacy? How can men of color begin to undo these intertwined ideologies they may have internalized to some degree?
I think it's really important to recognize that so much of American and broader Western white culture has been built, the power has been built by oppression and violence. And when you do that, and that's how you define manhood, there's this idea you have to keep power the same way, and you really do, honestly. You can't win a country with violence and then keep it with peace. And it's really important to recognize then that became the definition of success. It became the definition of manhood in this country. It became the definition of power in this country. And because whiteness is so ubiquitous in this society, because you really have to distance from it, because you don't actually want to say whiteness, and especially white manhood, is this violent thing, it becomes norm. And it becomes aspirational. It becomes a thing that we tell other people they have to aspire to. And it becomes the reason why, right? So the failure to live up to this definition of white manhood will be the reason why Black men, Asian men, Latinx men aren't powerful, right? Even though, of course, white male power structures would never let men of color actually reach that same level of oppressive power. But the question is do we want to? And I think that that's a question we need to be having, and we need to recognize that there is a sizable minority, at least if we're looking at voting records, of men of color who really feel like the great wrong done to them in a white supremacist society is their inability to live like white men. And so we need to be talking as a society about whether or not that's a goal we want, and talking about as communities of color as to who's actually defining manhood for our communities. Did we come up with this on our own, or are we still aspiring to this harmful, racist, sexist narrative that's been pushed upon us? And I think it's important to know that we get to define us, but we have to. It doesn't magically happen. We have to investigate where we have perhaps been programmed to not define ourselves and to just go with this default that we've been told isn't harmful, but actually is. Those are conversations that we need to have in our community. And I think that it's important to recognize that so much of what we think is aspirational was set and defined for us to keep us a part of this oppressive system. And we have every right to toss it all out and just define something from scratch and say, you know what, we're gonna do just what serves us. But that means though, we have to know what our goals are. And I want us to spend some time. This is part of why I love like talking with Black writers of speculative fiction. It is important that we spend time imagining new futures. It is important that we say, if we could be anything, what would we be? And really try to break free and say that there's this amazing new future out there for us if we design it. And then we have to look at what's stopping us. And there are a lot of systemic things stopping us, but there's also a lot of internal things stopping us that we need to have those conversations and kind of break free from. And toxic masculinity is really just an enforced, white male ideal in our society that we don't even realize we've adopted and that we're upholding ourselves.
I think it's my job as a moderator here is to point out one of the things I'm hearing. In that answer, I'm struck by how many times you said we and us, and like it is our sort of collective work to do this, right? I'm struck by that because there's so much truth in just this idea of we've all sort of bought into a narrative that we maybe didn't question, and we're all going to have to untangle from it. So I'm loving that. I want to get at a question here that many different people have asked in different ways in the chat. So I see Mary Dockin and Nicole Quino both asked a version of this. What are some of the chapters you were sure you'd write and didn't, but plan on exploring in the future? Or what topics did you intend to include, but ended up not including?
Oh man. So I absolutely thought for sure I was going to write a chapter on the auto industry. And I would still love to. I'm still absolutely fascinated with the racial and gender politics of the auto industry. And there's such a huge part of American mythology and the formation of this country. But it just didn't fit with what I had in there. And, there are just page limits. There's just so much I could write in one book, but I could write a whole book on the auto industry. And I did so much research behind it. So I still get sad. I still get antsy about the thought that like, it would be so dope to actually do that. I thought I would write more about the environment as well. When we look at some of the destruction of white male identity in America, one of the biggest victims has been the environment. And why I didn't, a lot was because I think that could have taken the book in a lot of directions that stylistically and everything were far away from this book. Like I would have had to get real science nerdy on it in a way that like would take a lot more time and research, and I think that that's vital, but it also would have been much more steeped in like the nuts and bolts of capitalism, which is important, but also, like I said, a slightly different book. But I definitely had planned initially, but also because I think the environment does come up multiple times in the book as as collateral damage. into white male power. So those were definitely two sections that I think, and if there was one I think I may one day end up, really actually writing about, it'll probably be the auto industry. I actually worked in the auto industry for a while. So it's something I think about a lot because I saw firsthand as usually the only Black woman in any room in the American auto industry. I was keenly aware of the racial, and gendered power dynamics, but then also even in my research coming up and seeing economically, like the role that like the founder of General Motors played in the Great Depression that a lot of people don't talk about was fascinating to me. I was totally intended on writing a chapter around it, but it just didn't fit the book.
I love it. I think it's good to hear you in there because there are multiple people. I'm not going here, but there are multiple people saying, "What else are you working on? What's next?" And I'm gonna let you just got done with this beautiful work of art. We're gonna let you be here for 1 minute before we ask what's next. No, the people are interested. I want to come to a question here from Susan Letcher, and she says in here, "My daughter just turned 3. In your view, what are the best ways that I can undermine this white male supremacist culture and raise her to be a confident, courageous, and independent young person?" And then she said, "Also, thank you so much for your work. You are one of my biggest heroes." And that's what got you in here, Susan.
Oh, thanks. I would say I'm not going to make assumptions on your child's race. I think you said a girl, right? Yes. And so I will give two sets of advice because it does matter. One, I would say if you have a child of color, it is really important that you raise your child with a full history, but a history that is not just traumatizing, that's uplifting. I think there's a tendency towards in public education for the race-specific education that many kids of color get to be nothing but trauma. And when I hear from young students of color, they say, it's really heartbreaking, really traumatizing. So make sure your house is a place where your child's race or ethnicity, if they are not white, is really celebrated and affirmed. But also make sure it's a place where you are regularly kind of allowing space to talk about hurt and talk about trouble. And as your kid gets older, they'll see that. But also just let your kids know, even from an early age, you see them. I didn't realize how quickly with my younger son that you have a Black kid who knows they're a Black kid and that they're like, and they notice you're not talking about it, that you're not saying things. And in my house, of course, I'm Black and it came up. But in his preschool, he was wondering why, like the kids in his school books weren't Black and why kids weren't saying Black. It's really important to press that. If you have a white kid, it is really vital that you actually make whiteness a real thing that you talk about, that they understand. And from an early age, kids can understand at least that things are sometimes really unfair or cruel for people who aren't white. And from a gender standpoint, it's important to recognize that as well. But I would say from a racial standpoint, especially just saying, yeah, sometimes people don't like people because their skin is a different color. And that's unfair. And it's something that we don't normally have to face. So we have this responsibility to speak out and talk about it. Your kid can understand that at a really early age. They know fair and unfair. They know right and wrong. And it's really vital at a young age that they start to recognize these things. And also allow, don't try to push your kid out of noticing difference. If your kid notices a person of color and they say that's a person of color, don't get embarrassed. So yeah, cool, and keep moving on. It's really vital that you normalize that. For gender, it's really, really important that you just be aware of all of the ways in which society is trying to gender your child. And it's important to recognize your child. If your child is 4, you have a guess at your child's gender right now, obviously. So know that and raise your child accordingly. You don't have a definitive gender for your child at 4. You have a guess. You have what your child is telling you. And you absolutely never have set gender roles. And so it is really important to be aware of the temptations to put your children in gender boxes, talk to them about it, affirm their rights to autonomy, bodily autonomy, and to point out all of the ways in which they are expected to participate in harmful gendered activities and expectations. Because even at a young age, you'll notice in daycare, in playgroups, in movies, that there's this expectations that girls will act a particular way and that they will absorb harmful actions that boys have. Challenge that. Even at a young age, we're like, hey, that doesn't seem right. Doesn't that seem unfair? Because kids have that instinct, and it's adults who tell them to ignore it. So having them trust their instinct that this is all nonsense, like this idea that boys get to, run things and get to run wild and get to, trample over the boundaries of girls isn't right. And young kids know that. And then we tell them, oh, that's how low boys act. Boys would be boys. Challenge that, be aware of that. So educate yourself around that. And then be aware of what the outside world is telling your kid. I know we're in a pandemic right now. The outside world is mostly just like whatever's on the computer screen and the TV, but this is a limited, this is a temporary state we're in. Your kid will be, if the outside world is out there waiting to try to enforce these harmful expectations on your child, and you need to just be alert.
That was great. Thank you so much. I want to try. Staff are gonna get mad at me, but I want to try to fit in 2 here. Okay,
let's do it.
All right, we gotta go quick because I know
what
time it is. Besides yourself, whose voices do you turn to for wisdom about how to move forward? And then I got one more for you after that.
There's voices that I feel like we should have been listening to for decades, right? So when I'm thinking like voices that I look forward to move forward, one, I talked about how much I love Black speculative fiction, right? So we should be, looking at Nora Jemisin, we should be looking at Octavia Butler, we should be looking at these, powerful voices. But also, I feel like there are classic works, whether it's, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, that if we had been listening 20 years ago, we would be so much further than we are. And there's, very little I could write that hasn't already been said there. And these are often things that I kind of go back to time and time again. But I also really love to look at all of the different spaces with which people of color, women of color, non-binary people of color are living right now and writing. And it's not necessarily writing about race. It's writing fantasy. It's writing about science. It's all of the different areas in which we exist, because that is all political. It all matters. And we have to recognize and stop limiting our idea of what we have to contribute as a society to just this struggle. So I would say, read those classics, you read your Baldwin, read your Angela Davis, and then also look and say, what does a Latinx, fantasy writer writing about right now? What is, an Asian American romance writer writing? And read that, because in that, what you're going to see is the imagination of different ways of being that we know that lives within us. But it also lives within the context of what we're in right now. It lives within that struggle as well, of us trying to imagine something new and different in a world that is actively trying to tell us, limit what we can be. And that's really where I live, is trying to see that and to create something new out of that. And there are some people whose whole life is dedicated to just doing that. And that's really, what I recommend.
I love it. All right. I'm going to ask you one more, but before I do that, I just want to say to everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in. I know we are right at time here, so we just appreciate so much everybody who came and spent the evening with us. Thank you to you, Ijeoma. We appreciate you. And anybody who has not already read or purchased Mediocre, Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, please go and do so. There's a chat link here, or there's a link in the chat here that you can buy it through independent bookseller Majors and Quinn, which just supports, literacy in our community, which helps keeps us all unified and educated, and it's so important. So please do that. All right, my last one for you. Earlier you said, there's that hubris of, oh, if I don't do it, no one will. And I appreciate you saying that, but I think at the same time, you've already seen how, so you want to talk about race, did inspire other people. As people go and they read this, what are you hoping for other authors or for young people or for teachers, for people who are going to go out and be in these spaces, getting their hands dirty, getting into these tough conversations and hoping to enact that social change and taking action? What do you want those next steps for them to be after they've read your book?
I want people to start looking for first I want people to say, what's being asked for, right? So if you're thinking like, I didn't even know this was a problem, trust me, it's something that people who aren't white men have been talking about in their neighborhoods and their towns time and time again, right? So I want you to think, if you didn't know this was a problem, if you read a part of either of my books and said, I didn't even know this was an issue, chances are that means you haven't been listening to the voices impacted by that issue who've been saying what's going on. So then you need to seek those people out and hear what they've been saying. Don't walk up and be like, can you explain this to me? Trust me, we've been saying what needs to happen in our schools, in our workplaces, in our banks, in our government for years. So seek those voices out, seek those demands out and say, where do I play a part? Where can I be of use? And that's the number one question I want people to ask. Where can I be of use? And so this means, like, if you are a white man, there are plenty of places you can be of use. Even if you think that, you're not strong enough, rich enough, whatever, trust me, the privilege you have in your identity means you're going to be listened to in spaces. If for me, as a light-skinned, middle-class Black woman, right, there are plenty of places where I can be of use to the transgender community, to the disabled Black community, right, to the incarcerated communities, to poor and other communities where I have privilege and power. And I have to look and say, who have I not been hearing? Where can I be of use? And then be of use. But that use has to be defined by the people impacted, which means you have to seek out what's been said and do the work. So if wherever you find something new, recognize it's not just a fact that you missed out on, it's a population you didn't hear. And you need to find those voices and prioritize them and let them guide your work.
I think that is a beautiful sentiment to close us with. Thank you so much, sister, for your work. We appreciate you and your time tonight. Again, thanks to the folks who tuned in from home. If you are interested in supporting friends or learning more about free events like tonight, there's a link in the chat for you to do that. Again, please check out this book, Mediocre, which I cannot wait to finish reading myself because there's so much good stuff in there. And we just want to wish all of you a happy holiday season from friends and say thank you for attending this event with us tonight. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.